So today, before we get started, I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am joining you from today is the unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan peoples. We recognize, honor, and respect the presence of the Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and recognize they are the original caretakers of this land. As part of our discussions today, I want to also acknowledge the colonial context of our workplace, its impact on our organizational systems and culture. I encourage you to take a moment and share which lands you are joining us from today in the comments section. To get us started today, I think we can head to the next slide, Natasha. Thank you. We're going to be doing a bit of an overview of well-being at UBC, the Activate Wellbeing Toolkit, why it was developed and what purpose it serves and how it can be utilized, what the steps are and how can you facilitate it, what materials have been created to support you in this process, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and discussions at the end. I also encourage you to ask questions throughout. You can put them in the chat box and we'll answer them as we go. And at the end, when we do questions and discussion, we'll also stop the recording. So if there's some that are more specific for your context, feel free to ask and save them for the end. Yeah, and I think that's everything. So I'll pass it over to Tash.
Thanks so much, Carly. We wanted to start just with some context to wellbeing at UBC. To ground us in the work that has preceded the creation of the toolkit, and also to give some context to how and why it was created. So the Okanagan Charter for Health Promoting Universities and Colleges was formalized on our Okanagan campus and created in 2015 at an international conference. And the Charter Development Committee consisted of representatives from the WHO, from PAHO, UNESCO, as well as leading academics and practitioners from around the world. So it was a global process and development. And the power of the Charter is that it provides us with a common language and a framework for what it means to be a health promoting higher education, for what we mean by health promotion within a higher education setting. There are two main calls to action in the Charter, the first being to embed health into all aspects of campus culture and across administration operations and academic mandates. And it's really this that's most relevant to us today, and how the toolkit aims to support the institution in achieving health and wellbeing for the campus community. In 2019, we created UBC's Wellbeing Strategic Framework. It implements or it translates the Okanagan Charter into a framework to guide actions and priorities within the specific UBC content. So you could say that it makes relevant the Okanagan Charter to UBC and to our context and landscape. And work is led by many units across the institution, and it's supported by the Office of Wellbeing Strategy. Our approach is holistic and focused on all community members. So it looks at both at staff, students, faculty, and community. And it focuses on the 6 priority areas: the mental health and resilience, physical activity, food and nutrition, social connection, collaborative leadership, and built in natural environments. And you know, important to note that these are overlapping. They influence and connect to each other. And it's not that our work is solely focused on these, but these are sort of primary or key areas in which our community feels that greatly support wellbeing. And it's important that many actions improve community wellbeing can be taken at the local level by individuals and teams, and that's really shown through the toolkit. And I'll hand over to Crystal now, who's going to give us a sense of where the toolkit came from and its purpose and rationale.
Thanks so much, Tash. Okay, so in terms of the Activate Wellbeing Toolkit and why it was created, it is considered for us a key implementation activity in order to advance UBC's Wellbeing Strategic Framework and our commitments to the Okanagan Charter. And really it came about after hearing from leaders across the institution, that there was interest in integrating well-being into strategic planning processes within departments and units using a structured but also quite straightforward process. Of course, we were very inspired by the Equity and Inclusion Office's Activate Inclusion Toolkit and the Indigenous Strategic Plan Self-Assessment Tool. And the toolkit really can be used by faculty and staff at all levels. So this includes leaders, managers, or directors, folks that sit on well-being committees who are planning action or communities of practice, anyone who really wants to include mental health and well-being in an annual planning process or action planning process. Historically, when we talk about well-being, people often think about individual health behaviors. So they'll think about, a key intervention being a yoga class or some sort of training or education program. And while these things are also important in their own way, we also recognize that creating environments and conditions that support well-being really requires deeper thinking and an exploration of how you can integrate well-being into everyday practices, processes, plans, and programs in day-to-day work. And so this toolkit really is aiming to expand people's understanding of what it means to support meaningful systems and settings-focused action and to support mental health and well-being in the workplace. You'll also hear us talk a lot about mental health and well-being, and the toolkit does highlight mental health specifically, recognizing that, this has been something that has always been very important to us, but particularly as we moved through the pandemic and pandemic recovery period, I think it really gained a lot more importance, and it continues to be a pressing concern. And a huge focus for us in our work, of course, is supporting psychologically healthy and safe workplaces. And we'll move to the next slide. So before we dive into the different phases of the toolkit, I'll talk a little bit as well more about the context and origins of the Activate Wellbeing Toolkit. And as I mentioned, it came about really in relation to interest from leaders and community members who wanted to take more of a thoughtful approach to advancing well-being locally. But we were having conversations about the need for a toolkit for many years, like probably since the development of UBC's Wellbeing Strategic Framework, but we weren't able to really collectively land on anything concrete. A few years ago, a colleague of mine, Karen Salby, who's on leave currently, we were working together, responding to different requests related to facilitating strategic planning processes. And there was a lot of really exciting work that was actually happening throughout the course of 2020 and 2021. Just to give you some examples, a change in colleague of mine in HR, Marianne and Boyles, and I were doing some exciting work with Faculty of Land and Food Systems. And Karin and I were working within Faculty of Medicine to support a few leaders who had 2 new communities of practice that really had a focus on well-being within Vancouver Fraser Medical Program. And they wanted some support with strategic planning and action planning. There was also conversations taking place with the strategic decision support team within the provost office. And so all of these conversations really influenced how the toolkit was designed. There was also a number of consultative conversations that happened, and so many different community members that reviewed it, previous iterations of the toolkit, and provided feedback. Those include colleagues from the Equity and Inclusion Office and the Office of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives, as well as talent development and engagement. And so, we do want to acknowledge that, this was a collective effort, and we really appreciated all of the valuable time and feedback that folks provided to get us to where we are today. The toolkit is geared really towards supporting focused conversation and action related to mental health and well-being. It is directly advancing the Wellbeing Strategic Framework, particularly within the collaborative leadership target of all units and faculties take action. And it also aligns with focus on people, which is HR's people plan. Within Catalyst 1, action within Catalyst 1, which you can see here, activates the UBC wellbeing strategy for faculty and staff through an approach that reflects the diversity of faculty and staff experiences. I also want to mention that we did consider an equity lens in the development of the toolkit, and also drew from the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to move into the 5 steps within the toolkit that essentially make up a strategic planning process. These slides mirror what is on the toolkit website in terms of having a description of the purpose of the steps and the associated activity. It has an estimated time for implementation, as well as facilitation ideas and downloadable resources. I also want to note before I get into the steps in detail that the toolkit can be really used and tailored and modified to adapt to the needs and strengths of the folks that are using it. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And it also takes an appreciative approach. And so this is really what we're focusing on here in step 1, which is identifying strengths and assets. So going through a bit of a brainstorming activity to identify what strengths and assets already exist, are already being utilized within an area, and how they can be leveraged moving forward. Next slide, please. And so we're going to move into step 2, which is the unit assessment conversation. Thanks, Tash. And this step is about identifying where folks can focus their action planning. Part of this includes description statements that fall within 4 categories. So I'll talk a little bit about these 4 categories. The first one, which is awareness and knowledge, involves areas that support and challenge mental health and well-being for staff. For example, awareness of mental health in the workplace, resources and supports that are available, and the role of well-being in the workplace. Strategy and planning refers to well-being and mental health showing up in strategic plans or operational frameworks related to workplace experiences. Operations refers to internal practices that shape workplace culture and expectations. And of course, recognizing that mental health and well-being impact how staff and faculty do their work. And lastly, evaluation and reflection, which is an ongoing process related to deepening understanding in terms of how well-being and mental health are impacted in the workplace. And so essentially, the user will be working with the group to reflect on different statements that are provided, and provide an opportunity essentially for folks to share their level of agreement based on a Likert scale. And there are different ways you can approach this as well in order to encourage honest responses. Some examples are like anonymous polling. And actually, I'm going to turn it over quickly to my colleague Carly to see if she has anything to add here in terms of the tailoring.
Yeah, so I think we've done a couple pilot sites with the toolkit so far, which has been incredible. And for this particular activity, folks are completing this first as individuals. And the idea is that we collect all of the feedback and look at it as a group. And so the dotmocracy approach is great. And one way to do that we've done before is we've built that activity actually into a break. So folks can kind of get up at their leisure and go plot their dots in those areas. And then once the group comes back together, they can look at that kind of more independently, objectively as a group, and look at where the team sits for each of those focus areas and what the opinions are. And it's a great opportunity just to notice and comment and share about what are we seeing here. As a team, do we have a pretty consistent opinion about where we might be as far as our awareness and knowledge? Is there a big disparity between some of our opinions? Why might that be? Using technology is a great tool as well. So I think Crystal mentioned that you could use collect those responses through technology and then present it on the board. And I know Tash will get into some of those tools and suggestions later, but we definitely have suggestions throughout some of the tools you can access that help you contemplate how best would we use this activity for our team or our community that we're working with. And so I've seen it, you know, there's lots of flexibility there. And yeah, I think it's a great step in the process.
Thanks, Carly. We'll move on now to step 3, which is identify possible actions. And so based on the focus area you ended up selecting in the previous step, you then will essentially work through an action planning exercise. Part of this entails reviewing topic statements. So you can see the sample worksheet here. The topic statements are in blue, and consider which ones are true, and circle those that might not be. And so after you go through that process, you'll then be choosing one of the topic statements where there might be interest to discuss further or energy around. And each of the topic statements have possible actions as well that are listed that could be taken. And so this is an opportunity to provide a bit of guidance or to get folks thinking in terms of what this could possibly look like. But of course, there's also opportunity for groups to create their own actions as well. We'll move to the next step, which is prioritize the prioritization stage. And so this is an activity where you'll be mapping out 1 to 3 actions from the last phase or the previous phase. And I think it's really important to mention that it is helpful to have a few actions here to include, because what I've noticed working with groups on similar processes is just that folks often might get attached to one action. However, that particular action might require a level of effort that's not necessarily realistic or feasible based on capacity at the time. And so this matrix is a really great tool. It provides the 4 columns to really help the team to assess the level of effort required, as well as the potential impact that the action could have. And so it provides that opportunity to reflect and to have conversation around the different actions, and identify one that's impactful and energizing, but also one that is feasible. And really that sweet spot is around the low effort, high impact area. You'll then think about a timeline for implementing the action, and you'll think about it in terms of, I guess, more short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And this is, of course, an important step in terms of accountability purposes, and designating a lead for the action and deciding on a target completion date as well. And then the last step, which is around measuring success, is really about collectively having a conversation about success criteria to help track progress. And so you'll include the topic statement that your chosen actions fall under here, and think about what success would look like and how you'll know if you've made progress or had an impact. And I'm going to pass it over now to my colleague Tash, who's going to talk more about some of the support materials that are available.
Thanks so much, Crystal. I think the tool is provided such a great process for groups to undertake, to explore what they do well and what they could increase or their focus on. And it's intended as a process that has some depth. And then, of course, if you're going into that process, you really want to have a strong planning process behind that. And I don't think the value of a strong planning process can be understated. The intention is that the toolkit takes somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. And so you want to really think about how that can be enacted with your group. And how you plan for any team or group engagement is going to be crucial to your success. And so recognizing this, we've developed some support materials. The first of our support materials is a Planning for Success guide, and it recommends a specific planning process to ensure constructive dialogue and actions emerge when the toolkit's used. We've got 4 core considerations within the Planning for Success guide, and they will help you get to the point where you're having the engagement and interaction really successfully. So first, you would want to identify your planning team, including a facilitator. And it's important to take some time here to recognize capacity, to recognize who should be in the room helping with the planning process, and to make sure that you've got enough support to do some of the legwork that's required in order to get into the room and have a conversation with the team. There's some specific information that you'll want to gather, and that's data from the West survey, for example, and other irrelevant information that's going to be helpful for your team to come together and have good and rich conversation. So it takes time to work that out. And we certainly recommend that you connect with your HR support, because you might find that there are pieces of information from the West that you haven't utilized before that could be very helpful. There are really important aspects of the session to consider. So you consider accessibility. You'll have to think about whether you want to do it online, in person, or perhaps a blend. Where would that happen and how would that happen? What's the sort of time frame that you need in order to plan for the event to occur? Are you doing it over a number of sessions, over one session? So lots of different considerations there. And then, of course, you need to finalize those materials, get everything together, book your room, and send your invites out, etc. So there's a process there that really helps you go through an excellent planning process. We've also developed a facilitator's handbook, because we recognize that not everybody will be familiar with different facilitation techniques and ideas. And this handbook provides some simple ideas for each of the steps. So it includes in-person and online examples for each step. For example, here we're looking at the unit assessment. And we chatted a little bit about this before. And so you might look at Dotmocracy as a way of doing that in person. Carly mentioned a great idea of doing that at a time in which you're having a break. So you can ensure that there is some level of anonymity, or at least some privacy within that process. But then if you're wanting to do, and you can do this in person or virtually, if you're really wanting to make it quite anonymous, then using a polling tool can be really helpful. Within the toolkit, you've also got a downloadable and editable PowerPoint that includes all of the slides you saw around the steps. And it really is intended as a plug and play. And we've created it to be a plug and play as much as possible. And it's editable, so you can really make it appropriate to your context. And it includes all the introductory pieces you might want to share with your team, as well as ideas around follow-up and how to share feedback with us. I'll pass it on to Carly to talk a little bit about further support and as well as next steps.
Thanks, Tash. Yeah, so we're at the point where we're thinking about, I'm sure everybody's percolating on what can I do next, or what opportunities might exist for me and my team or colleagues. And I think to really first take a look through all the things we've reviewed today. So you'll have a link to the Activate Wellbeing Toolkit online. And through there, you can access everything we've talked about today, the worksheets, the facilitator's guide, the planning guide. And that's a great way to get a sense of capacity and how to have those conversations and who you might want to have those conversations with. Definitely, if you have more questions, you can reach out to any of us. On the website, there's also a contact form to reach out for additional support. So that can look like, if you have questions around, this is the context of my team, and I want to better understand how I could develop a session suited to who they are, or these are some considerations I have. Those are definitely things we can support with and explore with you. And if you look on the website, there's a form to fill out, and then we'll get in touch with you. Some other things are just thinking about, I know Tash touched on the data and support. So we talked about the WES. There's also the Canadian Campus Wellbeing Survey that was conducted around the same time. So those are great tools to use. And through that process of preparation, it will probably help guide your discussion around what you might want to do moving forward. And I think that's the main thing we want you to know. You know, I've done this pilot 3 times, I think it has been so far, with different groups, and it's really incredible. It can feel quite overwhelming, I think, when you're first reviewing the tool, but what I want to reinforce all of us do is that it's designed in a way that you can take it and make it your own. We want to create this opportunity for you to determine, how do we need to proceed forward? Does it look like a 3-hour session? Does it look like a 5-hour session? Does it look like we incorporate a step at every team meeting we have? We don't have any expectations around how this is rolled out or utilized. And I think we have so many different communities on campus that look differently and function in different ways. And the idea is that this toolkit is just a guide. It's a guide and suggestion around how you could approach these conversations. But we want to create that opportunity for you to think about how it will work for you or your team. And we're just really excited. I see someone has a question, Tash.
Yes, we sure do. How about we close off now, and I'll stop the recording, and then we can head into some conversation.
Perfect. Thanks, Tash.